This is a new video series I want to do because I want to really go through this philosophy book that I got from Barnes & Noble. It's by DK. It's called The Philosophy Book, Big Ideas Simply Explained. And I think it's significant. As someone who, I've dabbled in philosophy myself. I've read the 12 books of St. Thomas Aquinas's commentary on Aristotle's metaphysics. I've read much of the physics. I've read some of Aristotle and some other people. I've looked into the pre-Socratics a great deal. Maybe should spend some time in some more contemporary things. But this book, I think, just from my background, my background is mostly in theology, but philosophically, I think this book is pretty sound. I think it has great history. It speaks of a lot of significant figures, even if just in passing, such as to me, if I were to chronicle the history of philosophy or of metaphysics especially, or speculative philosophy, which is where it begins in the words of Aristotle, beginning with Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, this Ionian or Milesian school, and then you of course have the Eleatics, then the pluralists, the Pythagoreans and the Platonists. And all these, that's kind of how the atomists are there as well, following because the atomists, what the atomists have in common with a lot of these thinkers, such as Anaxagoras, is that the statement Z differs from N in position and A differs from N in shape becomes significant. And that will make sense in due time. That's enough by way of introduction. I want to go through this work. I'm going to do it in parts. So I will start with Thales of Miletus. So everything is made of water. Thales of Miletus, circa 624 through 546 BC. In context, branch, metaphysics, approach, monism, before 2500 through 900 BC. The Minoan civilization in Crete and the later Mycenaean civilization in Greece rely on religion to explain physical phenomena. And then, in circa 1100 BC, the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, describes the primal state of the world as a watery mass. Circa 700 BC, Theogony by the Greek poet Hesiod relates how the gods created the universe. After early 5th century BCE, Empedocles proposes the 4 basic elements of the cosmos: earth, water, air, and fire. I think I'm actually going to put some tidbits in while I read this, because there's a couple things I want to say just already. So Hesiod and Aristotle will note this. Hesiod, as well as Homer, were the first to speak of an efficient cause, really, rather than a material cause. Because all these thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, they spoke of a first cause, or an arche, a principle of the natural world. However, they did not take into account the other causes. So there's 4 causes in Aristotle's view. I mean, if you've read, St. Thomas Aquinas has a beautiful work to Brother Sylvester. It's called On the Principles of Nature. And the principles of nature are, Aristotle is, of course, a hylomorphic philosopher. He revolutionizes Plato's thought in this regard. But the 3 principles of nature are matter, form, and privation. Of course, Aristotle also speaks, or rather St. Thomas also speaks of the 4 causes of nature, of the physical world, or rather the principles of nature, not causes, principles. That's the thing. The Greeks use principle and cause indifferently. The Latin doctors, and this is Christianity, but the Latin doctors use principle as opposed to cause, at least when speaking of the processions within the Trinity, but that's a different conversation. That's different. What was I saying? Oh yeah, Thales of Miletus. This point here that before Thales, Theogony was, we had Hesiod, and really, he and the other poets like Homer, they speak of how they speak through the lens of divine pedagogy on the origins of nature. Thales is different. Thales will not speak through superstitious nor mythological origins of theogony of creation, but rather it is a principle based on material. And that's the thing. These thinkers, none of these thinkers, Thales, who said that the first principle of the arche was water, Anaximander, who said that it was apeiron, or boundless and infinite, Anaximenes, who like Diogenes, said that it was air. None of these thinkers said that the arche, or first principle, was earth. And the reason why is because of its density. And when I say arche, I mean this is the single material substratum through which all of physical reality has as its principle, from which it proceeds. That is a statement of Milesian or Ionian, not just epistemology but metaphysics. This was not a theory of knowledge. This was a theory of being, of where the natural world came from. So anyway, after Thales, you have the early 5th century BC, where Empedocles proposes the 4 basic elements of the cosmos: earth, water, air, and fire, which I just spoke about. But the thing with Empedocles is you cannot say that he only posited 4 principles. He also posited the contrary principles, which is seen as a philosophical precursor to ekpyrotic models in theoretical physics today. That is, or rather, i.e., a cyclic model of the cosmos, created and destroyed via a process or rather through the principles of friendship or love and strife or hate. Now, in circa 400 BC, Leucippus and Democritus conclude that the cosmos is made up of solely atoms and empty space. They called this empty space the void, and Aristotle himself will critique this view, since it generates contradictions. But we may get to that when we speak of the atomists like Democritus and Leucippus. So here's Thales of Miletus. That's probably enough by way of introduction. That was a 7-minute introduction. I kind of want to do this for every video because the entries are kind of short. So if I can provide my own commentary for the entries, I think that could make for an interesting video. So here's Thales of Miletus, circa 624 through 546 BC. Everything is made of water. From observation, Thales deduced that specific weather conditions, not appeals to the gods, led to a good harvest. Predicting a high yield of olives 1 year, he is said to have bought up all the local olive presses, then profited by renting them out to meet increased demand. During the Archaic period, the mid-8th through 6th century BC, the peoples of the Greek peninsula gradually settled into a group of city-states. They developed an alphabetical system of writing, as well as the beginnings of what is now recognized as Western philosophy. This is why Aristotle concludes that Thales is the originator of this kind of philosophy. That is, speculative philosophy. There is also practical philosophy, but that is a different conversation. There's a distinction between the speculative and the practical in philosophy. That is a different conversation, though. Previous civilizations had relied on religion to explain phenomena in the world around them. Then a new breed of thinkers emerged, who attempted to find natural, rational explanations. The first of these new scientific thinkers that we are aware of was Thales of Miletus. Nothing survives of his writings, but we know that he had a good grasp of geometry and astronomy, and is reputed to have predicted the total eclipse of the sun in 585 BC. That is an interesting point, that we do not know much about Thales' writings. In fact, I will say this, I know this about this point. Aristotle, much of what we know of Thales actually comes from Aristotle, in particular his metaphysics. Aristotle will make claims such as Thales held the arche to be water because he held living things to be moist. An important point to be made here, though, is that Aristotle did not himself hold this view, that water was the arche, and that, especially for that reason, that because living things were moist. But I mean, I already mentioned Aristotle. When he speaks of principles of the natural world, he'll speak of matter, form, and privation. Matter is, of course, Heil Matter is in potency. So this is such a rabbit hole. I could talk about this for hours. So, okay, so this practical turn of mind led him to believe that events in the world were not due to supernatural intervention, but had natural causes that reason and observation would reveal. Okay, so now fundamental substance. This is when we get into Thales' most famous philosophical position. Thales needed to establish a first principle from which to work, so he posed the question, what is the basic material of the cosmos? The idea that everything in the universe can be ultimately reduced to a single substance is the theory of monism. This is material monism, and Thales and his followers were the first to propose it within Western philosophy. The text doesn't say this here, but the other material monists of the Milesian school were Anaximenes and Anaximander, who held that air and something called the boundless infinite apeiron were the arche respectively. Now, the idea that everything is made in the universe can be ultimately reduced to a single substance is called the theory of monism, which I just said. Thales reasons that the fundamental material of the universe had to be something out of which everything else could be formed, as well as being essential to life, and capable of motion and therefore of change. He observes that water is clearly necessary to sustain all forms of life and that it moves and changes, assuming different forms, from liquid to solid ice and vaporous mist. So Thales concludes that all matter, regardless of its apparent properties, must be water in some stage of transformation. There's also a graphic here, which may appear backwards to you, but I will read it. What is the basic material of the cosmos? It must be something from which everything can be formed, essential to life, capable of motion, and capable of change. Everything is made of water. Now this graphic, through these 4 points of argument, will make the claim everything is made of water because water has the necessary properties for everything to be made out of. It's something that from which everything can be formed. It's essential to life especially, and that was the biggest thing. Living things are moist, and it's capable of motion. It's capable of change. Water can change from vapor to ice to liquid. So this was Thales' position. Everything is made of water. So he observes that water is clearly necessary to sustain all forms of life and that it moves and changes, assuming different forms, from liquid to solid ice and vaporous mist. So Thales concludes that all matter, regardless of its apparent properties, must be water in some stage of transformation. Thales also notes that every landmass appears to come from an end at the water's edge. From this, he deduces that the whole of the earth must be floating on a bed of water from which it emerged. To claim that there must be some sort of, that there is always a boundary to water, so by that reason, water is the boundary to the universe, I find interesting reasoning. I don't quite follow it, but I find Thales interesting for this reason, for amongst these reasons. From this, he deduces that the whole of the earth must be floating on a bed of water. And that's the thing, these Milesians, these Ionians, they saw the earth as kind of like a disc or a frisbee floating in one of these expanses, which they considered to be the arche. So for example, for Thales, water rested on an expanse of water. And Aristotle, and there's an Aristotelian maxim, anything having a principle is based on its principle. That is what we're talking about here with the Milesians. And then another example, Anaximenes said that the earth, or rather that the natural world, flies like a frisbee or floats like a frisbee within an expanse of air, an infinite, an expanse of air. And then Anaximander, with his view on the apeiron, says that the earth exists in this boundless infinite matrix. But Anaximander is a different figure. Anaximander is a little more abstract than Thales and Anaximenes, in my opinion. Not abstract, but the concept of apeiron is a little less intuitive than water and air. That's all I'm saying. So, yes. When anything occurs to cause ripples or tremors in this water, Thales states, we experience them as earthquakes. However, as interesting as the details of Thales' theories are, they are not the main reason why he is considered a major figure in the history of philosophy. His true importance lies in the fact that he was the first known thinker to seek naturalistic, rational answers to fundamental questions, rather than to ascribe objects and events to the whims of capricious gods. By doing so, he and the later philosophers of the Milesian school laid the foundations for future scientific and philosophical thought across the Western world. So this is Thales of Miletus. There's a little biography with an image. I'll show you the image of him. This is Thales, the Ionian, and this is what it says. Although we know that Thales was born and lived in Miletus on the coast of what is now Turkey, we know very little about his life. None of his writings, if indeed he left any, have survived. However, his reputation as one of the key early Greek thinkers seems deserved, and he is referred to in some detail by both Aristotle and Diogenes Laertius. This is not Diogenes, the person who, like Anaximenes, spoke of air as the arche, but this is a different Diogenes, Diogenes Laertius, who is kind of like how Eusebius for Catholic Church history kind of chronicles history. Diogenes Laertius kind of chronicles a lot of these pre-Socratic guys. Kind of interesting tidbit from me there. Is a 3rd century biographer of the ancient Greek philosophers. Anecdotal evidence suggests that as well as being a philosopher, Thales was actively involved in politics and was a very successful businessman. He is thought to have traveled widely around the eastern Mediterranean and, while visiting Egypt, to have learned the practical geometry that was to become the basis of his deductive reasoning. However, Thales was above all a teacher, the first of the so-called Milesian school of philosophers. They exist, or Ionia, Greece. Anaximander, his pupil, expanded his scientific theories and in turn became a mentor to Anaximenes, who is believed to have taught the young mathematician Pythagoras. That is an interesting point. Pythagoras may have been taught by Anaximenes. And Anaximenes, who I probably will not talk about for a bit, but I will talk about... Oh, actually, I'll talk about him right now. Because there's this. That's it. That was the whole page. That was Thales of Miletus. I did that in 17 minutes, including my spiel as an introduction and my tidbits. But I will also say this. There's a C also here, which has Anaximander, Anaximenes of Miletus, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Democritus and Leucippus, and Aristotle. I can say a thing or two about all these people, but I want to save some things for later videos. So I will be brief here in just saying a brief how Thales relates to each of these people. So how he relates to Anaximander and Anaximenes is easy. They were material monists from the Milesian school. Anaximander with the apeiron and Anaximenes with air, presented as the arche respectively by these philosophers, these pre-Socratic philosophers. Thales presenting the arche to be water. And when I say arche, I mean the single physical substratum or material substratum from which the natural world proceeds from. That is in my words what arche means, at least in the Milesian context. There are other contexts, like, Origen, the Christian theologian, talks about how, principia is taken in many ways. I feel like arche is as well in Greek. But that's a different, But anyway, let me say how he's related to Pythagoras. So, Pythagoras and Thales, they both, well, hold on. I have this note here. Pythagoras. Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay. We don't have to talk about that because Pythagoras we'll talk about in a later video. And Empedocles we can definitely talk about because the thing with principles, I'll say this about Pythagoras actually. Pythagoras held numbers to be the principle of all natural things, which is his numerological philosophy, his numerological his metaphysical view on numbers is why he's considered significant. Numbers as the principle. Plato will hold ideas or forms to be the principle, but Empedocles. I'm going to move on from Pythagoras and Thales because I don't want to speak about that right now. I want to speak about Empedocles. Empedocles, who, like Thales, held there to be a principle, but Thales was a material monist. Empedocles was a pluralist, like Anaxagoras What in the world does that mean? Well, Empedocles held there was more than one principle of the natural world, while material monists like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes held there to be only one. So, what that means is, for Empedocles at least, that there are principles: earth, water, wind, and fire. The order is not important, but what is important is to note that Empedocles also posited friendship and strife, or love and hate, as cyclic principles in creating and destroying the world. And Democritus and Leucippus, these atomists, they concluded that the cosmos is made up of solely atoms and empty space. Now, this came after Thales, of course, as did Empedocles. But this approach here generated contradictions, and that's what Aristotle says. You know, the void, the concept of the void, and it has to do with the distinction between continuous and contiguous. You know, it's like the void is, you know, if there really were void, that would mean that being is like broken up. You know, like that there's literally empty space. You know, there's contradictions there.